Can everyone hear me all right? Yeah, good. So I did say earlier that normally when I start talking about fish, everyone sort of backs away and disappears, but you're all trapped, so you have to watch it. I didn't really know sort of people's backgrounds on fish, so some of this might be quite basic if you've got a kind of an understanding of it, but for me, fish nationally, internationally, overlooked and underappreciated. I've been interested in fish since I was a small child, and I've worked in the fisheries and sort of fisheries conservation world for the last sort of 17 years, something like that. So you can tell my wife's not here because she's had to listen to this for a long time. So I'm going to give you some sort of basic stats. They're as right as I can find out. If anyone wants to challenge them, you're welcome to. If you're not sure what that is the detailed river network of the North East. So we have a lot of water. But we'll start off. So surface of the Earth, approximately 71% water. And all of the water on it is about 3% of that is fresh. And this is going somewhere, it is linked to fish. Out of that fresh water, estimates are about 0.3 to 0.5% is available fresh water, so the rest of it's locked up in glaciers, groundwater, that sort of thing. And globally, it's about 30,000 fish species. That goes up and down constantly. We're constantly finding new ones going extinct, so it averages out. But it's roughly a 50-50 split between marine and freshwater. So if you go back to the stats on the previous page, about 50% of our fish species globally exist in 0.5-ish % of the water we've got on the planet. So I put this up here because when you talk about biodiversity and fish, people think about coral reefs, which are, incredibly biodiverse, but actually, you find equal levels of biodiversity and interest in kind of muddy pools and streams that you wouldn't look twice at. Why do fish matter? Obviously they matter to me, and I'm not going to get into the economics and things like that. But they're adaptable and resilient, and when we look at how fish species behave and evolve and how they survive in different environments, I've been out and surveyed waters that you wouldn't think anything survived in them at all. Bits of the Whitecroft Burn at the Nature Reserve shouldn't support fish, but they do. And they're a crucial part of the aquatic ecosystem. So even if you're not interested in fish, if you like otters, or you like piscivorous birds, or you like anything like that, or a functioning ecosystem, they form this huge part of that. And they help us understand what's happening beneath the surface. So if we pay attention to fish populations and how they're moving, how they're developing, that tells us what's going on. And it's much more, you can understand much more than you could through just, say, water sampling alone. I'm not discrediting water sampling. But for people who haven't seen it before, a fish's scale grows like a tree, and you can read the age of a fish by reading the rings on its scales. And when it grows fast in the summer, slows down in the winter, so you can tell, I'm not going to point with the mouse, but the darker rings on that will show you the winter growth, and you can track that. What that helps to tell you is if a fish isn't growing, there's something wrong, and you can tell how that's progressing. But globally, again, about a third of freshwater species are threatened with extinction. Can anyone tell me what that is? So that is a burbot. It's a British native species, last seen in the UK in 1969, so the most recent extinct fish species in this country. So when we talk about extinctions, it's not just happening in the Amazon basin, it is happening in Britain. So in the local context, as you can probably tell, I'm not from the North East, and I moved up here 3 years ago to work in fisheries. And even for someone who's worked in this world for quite a long time, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the only species in the northeast is the salmon, because it's all anyone speaks about. And this is not discrediting salmon, incredibly important species we need focus conservation efforts on them, but not at the cost of everything else. And if you only focus and talk about salmon, you're missing huge opportunities elsewhere. I upset a lot of my colleagues in the Environment Agency by saying that. So, this is just poor editing on my part. Non-exhaustive, so we talk about salmon's the only thing people really talk about. When we talk about fish, quite often they're categorised in these game fish species. And I'll get onto the language in a minute, but I have a bit of an issue with it, but you'll hear the terminology used. So game fish, salmon, sea trout, brown trout, same thing, grayling, characterised by the salmonids, this thing in the red circle, the adipose fin. The salmon is the only ones that have it. Coarse fish are basically everything else. Again, not an exhaustive list. And then what get referred to as minor species. So the stuff that never really grows above 5-10 centimetres maximum. And then we have the miscellaneous, the eels and lamprey. They don't really ever go into any of it, but could also count as all of it. And as with a lot of conservation and ecology and things like that, I think the language we use is important. This game, coarse and minor phrasing, it really comes from angling and from eating fish. The game fish were the ones that people liked to fish for. They were the ones that people liked to eat. Coarse fish literally comes from, they're not very nice to eat. They're coarse. And they were the poor man's fish. And then the minor species is that they're so small, why would you bother with them? But actually, they're all as important as each other, and by kind of categorising it like that, we're almost disincentivising the conservation efforts of the other species. And you'll also hear people referring to fish as migratory fish, so eels, salmon, trout, things like that. We now know that, and we're still building an understanding of, that every fish migrates. Coarse fish migrate huge distances to look for spawning habitats, for food, everything like that. So by determining some species as migratory and others as not, again, we're kind of ignoring them. And now I'm going to get on to some actual fish for the northeast and just go over some interesting information. So, not necessarily overlooked. A lot of people know about trout, Thermotrata, but there's some interesting facts. So, brown trout are one of the most genetically diverse vertebrates known. And there's a stat, according to the World Trout Trust, there are more genetic variants of brown trout in the UK than of human beings anywhere on Earth. They have this incredible ability to adapt and change and develop new habits and niches. And that you find them everywhere, from small southern streams to the northern spate rivers, all over Europe. And they evolved to continue to sustain and replenish populations. We as humans have got in the way of that a little bit. But when people talk about sea trout and brown trout, they're the same thing. When a brown trout spawns, after a couple of years, a certain population of its young, and we don't quite know what defines it, will go through a process where they migrate out to sea. The rest of them stay in fresh water. Those ones that have gone out to sea will grow. They go off to the up sort of Greenland area and places like that. They'll grow massive in comparison to their inland counterparts. They migrate back in and they spawn. So what it does is, if the fish back in the UK, for instance, if that river gets wiped out by pollution or by an environmental incident, those sea trout come back and continually replenish that population. And unlike salmon, sea trout will continually return, to a point, will go back in and out. So we have records of sea trout coming in and out of the Tyne, for instance, 5 or 6 times to spawn and going back out to sea. But salmon don't do that, salmon die. And for anyone familiar with this, pretty hostile environment to live in if you're a small fish. This is the Upper Tees. Has what is considered to be probably the largest population of native wild brown trout in the country. And if you're a small fish, that's where that fish is from. If you're a small fish, you find it quite hard work living in there. And that can't be replenished because the fish can't get over high force. Next ones. Roach and rudd. if anyone can tell me which one's which. There's a very easy way to tell. But if you've sat in any of the hides at the nature reserve and you've seen the fish splashing around or swimming around in the shoals, that's what this is. And they occupy they live in rivers and still waters, but they're a really integral part of still watering ecosystems. And again, they get kind of fobbed off, they're no good to eat. Anglers do fish for them, but less these days. But if you watch the otters, for instance, that's what they're eating most of the time. And they occupy similar space, but if you can see the lower one here, so the lower one is a rudd, the upper one is a roach. If you look at the shape of the mouth, the rudd feed on the surface. So again, when you see fish jumping out of the lake, they're taking flies off the surface. And when I say they're long-lived, I've done scale sampling on still waters for roach, where we found roach in Northumberland that are sort of 15, 16 years old, living in angling lakes. And if you think that they're spawning every year, every summer, constantly replenishing that, if they disappeared, there's nothing there to fill that gap. They breed well in rich, shallow waters, again, Costa's Nature Reserve, but they have to have predators. So one of the things that they occupy this niche, and if you don't have a balanced ecosystem, especially rub, they will just breed and breed and breed and breed and breed, and then you have problems. And that is where the perch comes in. Personally, probably one of my favourite fish. Really effective predator, and they've got no teeth, but if you look at their mouths, they have these huge cavernous mouths, and a fish, even from very small, will attack things that are the same size as it. But they are essential for keeping populations of silverfish under control, but we're now more and more understanding their effectiveness at keeping signal crayfish under control in isolated populations. So they will switch on to almost exclusively crayfish diets when smaller fish aren't available. And some of the waters in the Tees, that is from the Tees, when you get them in surveys and things, you can feel they're rock solid because they're just full of bits of crayfish, basically. So, but again, as an indicator, if you've got big perch, you've got a lot of food, and you can kind of tell if it's a place that doesn't have big issues with crayfish, you know that means the rest of the fish are spawning well. They are, unfortunately, though, susceptible to high temperatures. So they thrive in Scandinavia and places like that, which are much more stable. We're seeing more and more big losses of perch populations, especially in the south of the country, due to climate change. And that is the scale from that fish. So if you ever touch perch, you'll find that it's really, really spiny and like rough. And that is because if you look at the top of it, it's covered in this spiky surface. What you could tell from that is that fish is about 5 years old, which means that it's eating something in the Tees. And then the last one, European bullhead. If you search bullhead, what will come up is the American bullhead, which is the ridiculous looking catfish. It's not that. But it is. It's not one of our prettiest looking fish, but it is. It's quite. It's got quite a personality. They're very angry. They're also, for showing kids and for demonstrating things, they're really easy to catch. If you're turning stones over, if you kick sampling, things like that, you'll find them. But they require clean, fast-flowing water and clean gravels. And in the northeast, we're lucky that a lot of our rivers have that. In the south, they're disappearing at quite a rapid rate because of smothering of gravels. They basically create little nests underneath rocks, and they'll lay their eggs on the underside of them. So if you are turning rocks over and you find one and there's eggs on it, put that down. But what you can't necessarily see in the left-hand picture is they've got quite savage little teeth. They're not big enough to bite you, but you wouldn't want to be a shrimp near that. But again, they are listed. under the Habitats Directive, and they're on the red list, and that is because of that requirement of that habitat that is being just constantly eroded. And the brook lamprey. So we've got 3 species of lamprey in the northeast. You've got brook, river and sea. You can go up in size in that order. They are probably the weirdest looking thing that we have in swimming around in British waters. They're prehistoric, and fossils apparently indicate that lamprey in some form were around before the dinosaurs. And they basically haven't changed since then. They don't have a jaw. They develop a kind of a circular mouth with sort of weird teeth on it. So have you ever seen Star Wars, the thing that like sucks them in the desert? It's basically that. And they have very, very specific habitat requirements. So unlike, say, trout, for instance, where they'll dominate kind of gravel areas with pools, they need really fine gravel to spawn on, but they also need fine sediment and silt where they build nests after they spawned, and nests of juveniles will live in amongst this silt until they reach adulthood. So they're called amacotes, and when they're juveniles, and what you see here is these are both juveniles. You see they haven't got an eye. And I don't understand why. I've never quite got it, but they don't develop an eye until they become sexually mature. It's inside the head, but they can't see. They are, again, listed on a whole load of things because of habitat destruction. So that's a closer picture. So no eye, and then they develop it. Once they've developed that, they develop the jaw, they spawn, and they die. So it feels a bit of a cruel trick that they can only see for a very short space of their life, and the rest of it, they just live in the mud. So when I started this, and I said, kind of underappreciated, one of the constant issues with fish is that they don't get recorded. Unless people are doing active sort of electrofishing or netting surveys where they are recorded as part of kind of scientific research, nobody documents fish. Anglers, there is on average, there's about 1 million people go fishing in the UK. And there's some stat that says that averages out about 17 days per angler. So 17 million days of fishing, no records. Arguably, some of those anglers can't tell the difference between fish species. But this is the wild web, and you'll see that ray-finned fish, I can't pick out quite which blue it is at the top. It's one of them, but it's pretty small. So definitely under-recorded, and this is not a dig at the wild web. This is just the set of data that I've got. But according to iNaturalist, there were 1,195 species recorded, that many observations, and how many were fish? And 3 of those I put on there. So, yeah. So that's, the issue that you find is that if there's no records, and having spent a lot of my career going out to pollutions, environmental fish kills, drought incidents, things like that, if you have no records, there is no baseline. And I've been to places where I know there were fish, and I know people have fished it, but nobody's recorded anything, and I have no way of proving what's gone on. And once those species are gone, because we build weirs in the way, and we do all sorts of other weird things with rivers, it's very, very hard to get them back. So if you know anglers, make them record the fish that they're catching. And there are lots of other ways that you can get out and get involved with rivers trusts, Environment Agency, people like that, when they do fish surveys, to learn more about it. And that is bang on 20 minutes. It's almost like a time stat. Has anyone got any questions?